Hello, everyone. I'm Sheree Burton, and this is the Soul Rose Show, where ancient feminine wisdom meets the modern path of soul evolution. I am so grateful for every one of you who tune into this podcast, and I would love it if you could leave a positive review so more people can find this content who are deeply searching, perhaps hurting, and needing some guidance, grounding, and perspective. I want to thank Body Sound, who left us a review. She said, "I'm so grateful. Your discussions are validating so many reasons why I'm lighting up on some things I'm pulling together. Thank you for the opportunity to learn so much more about your insights. Even more, I love all the guests and the discussions exploring their passions. We all have ways to show up in this life and share something beautifully unique with the world. Many blessings." Thanks again for that, Body Sound. Today, we're exploring how you can put your pain on the page. Healing trauma by landing it into some kind of form. We've got Andrea Seiler on. She is my friend who has just put out this beautiful book into the world called A Poet's Playground: Savage Poetry for Inner Child Healing. This will be a powerful episode for you if you feel a pull to use art or creativity or words to move through deep emotions. Andrea, welcome to the Soul Rose Show.
Hi, how are you?
So we were talking earlier about, the importance of sort of grounding into why we do the things we do, why we take on the projects we take on, why our soul is called to do certain things that don't make a whole heck of a lot of sense. And I know that you've just recently put a work out in the world that was quite vulnerable for you. And so I'm curious, I know a little bit about, but I'd love for you to share with our listeners what brought you to the place where you're like, okay, I'm going to write a book of poetry. I'm going to do this and I'm going to put it out to the world.
So, I didn't decide to write a book of poetry. I didn't even know I was going to start writing. I was writing about my life, my happy life, and planning for my future post empty nest or in the middle of an empty nest. And it got ugly real quick, and I didn't expect it. And then the way I describe it, it was like I was hemorrhaging all over the pages. And so I ended up in this dark cave. I couldn't get out, and I had to just keep writing and writing, and then I would put it away because I didn't wanna look at it. I was like, "What's happening to me?" And then I just ended up in, like I said, in this dark cave, in this grieving period of my life, and then a lot happened after that. So it was a 2.5-year process, and I didn't even know it was gonna turn into poetry. Poetry is what made me be able to digest the hemorrhaging, if you will.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you kind of were in this transitory cave period where you're kind of metamorphosing like the cocoon and the butterfly and the caterpillar soup, dark night of the soul stuff. So it was a way for you maybe just to anchor into what was going on. Even though you say you were hemorrhaging, there was probably had some awareness that there was some purpose to it or it had some meaning behind why it was coming out that way on the page.
And to make sense of it, I couldn't make sense of it, but fast forward to when I was getting ready to publish, which I wasn't going to publish. I changed my mind 5 times. I didn't even want to do it. My daughter talked me into it. There was this whole process, but somebody said, "What is your book about?" And I couldn't say, "Well, it's about hemorrhaging." But really, the way I explain it now, looking back, is that my inner child showed up when I was writing, and she pushed me right out of the way. She's like, "I have some stuff I want to say. You've been
Mm.
denying and bypassing my voice for 50 plus years. I'm not to give my age away, but I'm fine with it." And now I'm ready to speak. So, as I'm writing about my life from my perspective, my inner child just came out and was ready to just take over. And she was hanging out the whole time. And I wouldn't have ever referred to it as my inner child. I would have said my soul was speaking, or that inner voice, or my
Mhm.
intuition. But for this book specifically, it was my inner child. So it's very much written from the perspective of my inner child, the pain I was not addressing, and also the younger versions of me that didn't have a chance to speak because I was so busy in the throes of my roles of life as a woman and a wife and who I thought I should
Mhm.
be on the outside.
Yeah. So it came from a place of just this wounded inner child who was sort of screaming to be heard. Sometimes those voices don't come alive for us until we are in that dark
Mhm.
abyss or
Mhm.
whatever. But some really powerful art can come
Mhm.
through. And I knew you before this book came out. You and I have kind of had some conversations here and there. I don't even know how we met, to be honest. I think we connected through a mutual friend. But when I got it, and I knew I wanted to read it right away because I know a little about your soul, and I know that it was a labor of love. Because I know originally you were going to write your story. Like you and I connected way back, just you writing your life story or something, or a memoir based something or other. And so I was just really pleased that it turned into poetry. A lot of times people don't know they have poetry in
Hmm.
them until they're like you said, hemorrhaging, or they're excavating some deep pain, or they're tapping into a part of them that's been silenced, like you said. So let's talk a little bit about that process. I mean, I think a lot of people feel like they have something in them like
Hmm.
this, whether it's a piece of art, maybe they want to start a project or a program or a book or a something where they want to give to the world, if you will, some of their pain to share in it. Did you have some awareness around like, I want to gift this? It's not really about me necessarily, it is, but bringing it out into a public medium like this brings it into the space of others. So did you have some awareness of like, hey, I want to gift this to humanity in some degree so that maybe somebody can resonate with what I was feeling when I got this out?
Not at first and not along the way, because the process was, I mean, it took me 2.5 years to finish it. It was a stop and go, which I've learned is normal for writers. I distracted myself by going and getting jobs and doing very physical work, because that's how I dealt with my pain in my life, was being very physical, which is another thing I learned about myself. But then ended up injuring myself, tearing my rotator cuff in two places, and was forced to sit back at home again, and then started the writing process again. And so I didn't know what was happening to me. Every time I tried to distract or stop, it was almost as though it wasn't an option. It was like I had to write. And so I'd sit down to do it again. It was very painful. And so, as a respite to the words that were coming out and the truths that were coming out, I intuitively just started doing art, and I started smearing paint everywhere. And that's how the cover came. I didn't even know the cover was
Mhm.
going to be the cover. That was one of my first pieces of art, smearing and painting trees.
I'm just going to hold this up for those of our people that are watching on YouTube.
Yeah,
It's beautiful.
thank you.
It's beautiful art. Yeah.
And my daughter was like, once we were down the road, down that process, she's like, you have to make that your cover. Well, that didn't follow the rules or the guidelines for book covers, but this whole book is about not following rules. And so,
Yeah.
really, not until the very end when I said, okay, I'm going to publish. And I'm talking, that was at the very end. I mean, I went to push that publish button and I'm like, nope, I can't do this. But then that's what pushed me to finally publish, was like, I have to share this process with people that are in pain and they're trying to figure out how to get out of it. And I've done it grasping for everything. I mean, I have done everything. I'm a triple certified yoga teacher. I've taught yoga. I've done courses and classes. I've read hundreds of books. I have journals. And then this just came out of nowhere and took two and
Mhm.
a half years. And so I didn't know until I did. That's the answer, is that I have to show
Yeah.
people that it's okay to feel your pain and hemorrhage all over
Mhm.
the place. I wouldn't have said that as I was going through it, because when I was going through it, it was grief. It was all grief. And I didn't even know it.
Yeah, that's one thing that struck me is, I don't know if you've ever heard the phrase the grief mysteries.
No.
And that it's a phrase that, because I noticed a lot of undertones of a lot of stuff about grief, and I'm actually looking at page 108, and there's a lot of, that was actually something I dog-eared, was about grief. We can read it in a second, but the grief mysteries are a portal that you pass through as kind of an initiation into higher learning, higher consciousness, higher vibration states. So it's like the only way to kind of like access a certain, you could say, compassion or state of love or power is through grief.
Mm,
And the grief is tailored specifically to each soul and what would tug at our heartstrings the very most.
mm,
So it could have been something that occurred in childhood. It could be, my chronic grief was attached to placing a baby for adoption when I was in my 20s. And it's a whole incredible story now, but that's turned into something really
mm,
beautiful. But I see that experience of losing my firstborn daughter as my initiation into the grief mysteries. And I wrote poetry for the first
Oh,
time after I
okay.
placed her. When you're talking about the 2.5 year process, well, I'm coming up on 7 years on my book. So I think you're doing good. I have a developmental editor who I'm working alongside because I just have so much that I want to put in there when you're writing about your life. And we're trying to scale it down. And she is assuring me that a lot of times when people start a memoir, it's a minimum of 4 years. So you're good. The reason yours is powerful is this is true of poetry, I think, in general, is that you can create a lot of white space on a page and say a lot of really deep things with less
Mhm,
words. And that allows the reader to extrapolate their own meaning.
mhm.
So they're not necessarily even reading into your meaning. They're putting it into their own experience, their own, lens or perspective and extrapolating the meaning that way. But are you okay if I just, now that we're talking about grief and I already have this dog eared, are you okay if I read this part on
I'm okay if we read several parts because there's some profound
yeah,
pages that,
I was going
yeah.
to. Yeah, for sure. But this one is called Ambiguous
Mm,
Grief. When I see mothers and fathers holding, embracing, touching, lifting, and loving their children, wondering what that would have felt like and how that would have changed my entire world. I finally see and trust myself as a mother. I watch as my children feel safe and seen. I watch as they sleep and they grow, watch as they cry, laugh, ponder, and play. I hold space for them to become who they truly are so they can have a voice, a choice, a place. And my bleeding heart slows to a peaceful beat just for this moment as I breathe. As I look back, love intentionally, give freely and tirelessly, I grieve. And just for a moment, when I let go of what I so desperately longed for as a little girl, a young woman, and a mother, I realize forever I will grieve. I accept this knowing and I hold myself with no shame. My children are beautiful, wonderful adults now. That brought up some emotion for me. I know it brought up some emotion for you because this is just pure truth, right?
mhm,
Just that line right there, like I got full body chills, like forever I will
mhm.
grieve. I know it's hard to feel into the meaning to go back to that place when you wrote it because sometimes that's a moment in time we can never recover. But what was that about for you, do you think? What did that mean in that moment?
That's not a moment in time for me, that's my whole life. That's
Yeah.
still today, like, to not know. I mean, when I was younger, I used to watch families and wonder why they were so happy and what it was like for people to have parents. I was that kid on the street, that would ask people for rides home and they would be getting into cars with their mom and dad and they'd be like, "No, we can't give you a ride." And I'd walk home alone and stuff. So I always grieved that and I still grieve that. But that just made that into the book. So it was like I
Yeah.
just put it into words, and that's why when I was a mom parenting my kids, I'm still a mom. But with little kids, it was like every day I was so attuned and present with my children in everything they did. I knew that their emotions, and I was just so present because there was no one present for me. And so now I understand that the wounds became my values. My core wounds became my values, and my values were
Yeah. Your
to
gifts, really.
cherish my children because they're just so precious. And I know they felt that.
Yeah.
So, but
Yeah.
I
What a
grieved.
gift to
Yeah.
them.
I
Yeah.
was grieving when I was parenting them. The whole time I was grieving every day. You can see it in pictures of
Mm.
me. You can see it. My daughter can see it.
Because it was like through parenting them, you were reckoning with the unhealed parts of yourself that weren't parented in the way that, this whole window you missed really of being nurtured and
Mhm,
loved in the way that you needed to
mhm,
have that space held for you as you grew. And so that's so powerful. It's kind of brings me into this, I don't know if you've ever heard this term conscious suffering, but when I think about grief, I think about conscious suffering. And I know suffering is a choice. I realize that now, but there were times in our lives that we suffered, we kind of had to
mhm,
because we didn't have the skills to know or the semblance of mind.
mhm,
But grief is one of those really interesting, and I think there's no other way than being a mother. Like I hate to say it, I know there's people out there listening to this who are not a parent, and so I'm treading on this very lightly when I say this, but there is no grief like the potential loss of a child in any form, whether you're losing them to the world, so to speak, or they die or they get a severe mental illness they don't come back from, or just these kind of existential fears we have around our children. And when I've stepped into that, because I have 6 children, I go into why would that be up for me so strong if I didn't have the same fears for my own inner child and my own self, that I would be lost to these things, right?
Mm,
And so, yeah, I grieving for a lot of my older children's, because I have 4 kids in their 20s and then the 2 younger. And I parent completely differently now
mhm,
that I have this 9 and 11-year-old and I'm 55.
mhm,
It's just so interesting, especially with my 9-year-old daughter, what she brings up in me, in my little girl self.
mm,
For some reason, missed the first daughter, just,
mm.
missed that round and is just now showing up in this, it's like such a gift. So what was this turning point for you? Because I know what it's like to be literally on the floor in a cave, metaphorically. You are right in the middle of the unknown, in the thick of it. You're not sure this is ever going to
Mhm.
pass. You're just kind of like, hey, I know. Okay. So was there a turning point for you where you were like, all right. And then how did that parallel with the book being published? Do you know what I mean? Like, was there a moment in time where you're like, okay, it's time to kind of come out?
Well, that's a good question, and I think I can answer that. But like I said, I didn't expect to be in this kind of pain. And you said something a minute ago about our suffering as a choice. And it wasn't a choice for me. It was, and I use this as a metaphor as well. It was like I was treading water in the ocean. Just in life, you're treading water. So I'm treading water,
Yeah.
and then something just
Yeah.
grabs my ankle and drags me down to the bottom. And now I'm in this dark, that's
Mm.
another metaphor. I'm in this dark place. I also use a metaphor as like a knot. It was like, I'm in this dark place. What's wrong with me? And a lot of stuff was coming up, like I said, over a time period. And I'm like trying to just I'm peeling myself apart. I'm examining my relationships, my family, my marriage, and I just kept going deeper and deeper and deeper until I got to the very bottom. It was dark. I couldn't get out of it. It was a scary place. I shut everyone out. I became estranged from family. My husband and I's marriage was I want to use the word just dead. I fell completely out of love with him, but we're still together. But it was just like I literally had to stop loving everyone and everything in order to figure out what was going on. So the suffering really wasn't a choice. But in answer to your question, as I began to untangle everything, and because I was also learning, I wasn't just laying in my bed, with the blinds closed for 2.5 years, right? There
Mhm.
was a lot of sleeping, there was a lot of warm showers, there was a lot of that, what you would imagine a suffering person to be in. But because of my lifestyle and my habits, I also got up, I did yoga, I fed myself nutritionally, I went for long walks.
That's really powerful.
Yeah, I contacted, and thank goodness for my yoga background, right? Because my body was failing me. I lost muscle mass. There was a lot going on physically, and I recognized it. So it's like, well, that intellectual part of me was like doing the things, but the grieving and the pain part of me was suffering. And
Mhm.
and then I'm writing and I'm doing the art and I'm learning. I was following all these people that could answer my problems, particularly psychologists and people that would cover things like family estrangement, relationships, anything that I was figuring out. And then at some point, when I came up for air the 20th or 30th time, there was something in me that said, okay, you're going to drown. You need to grab the life raft because this is your last chance. And it was like I just grabbed the life raft and then I just hung on. And then it was about kind of what you said about like, okay, now I have to choose to save my own life here. And it wasn't an
Mhm.
unfamiliar place because I suffered from depression my whole life. I just didn't know that's what it was. And I
Right.
suffered from
Right.
some suicidal thoughts occasionally, but I always worked myself out of that because I had children and you don't talk about it when you have children because they'll get taken away from you. So I just kept that to myself. Well, now nobody can take my kids away. They're in their 20s,
Yeah.
So
Yeah, that's so interesting. I am a suicide survivor because I did lose a sister who was a mother of 5 to
mhm,
suicide. And I know that in my research, that you'd be hard pressed to find somebody who hasn't entertained suicidal ideation. It's very alive in the
Mm,
consciousness, and especially as you're trying to mitigate, trauma that wants to rise, and you're not sure you have the capacity to address it, or that whole fight, flight, or freeze thing.
mhm,
That's why this poetry can be such a powerful medium to let that come out. And it's not right or wrong or good or bad. It just is, right?
mhm,
It's just that raw, visceral
mhm.
shadow and light. So I'm curious if you have like one that means the most to you of all of the poems, or one that just is really alive for you, that has really a lot of deep, rich metaphor and meaning to you.
Well, I have about 100, but the book is what, 242 pages. But one of the chapters in the contents of my book is deconstruction because as I was
Mm.
going through this, I was also deconstructing from religion as well. And I didn't realize I did, but it's very clear now I've been deconstructing from religion for almost 20 years.
Do you mind me asking what your religious background is?
So it's not simple. I came from
It's not like one particular
No,
denomination.
because I came from a very broken family and there was a lot of chaos and I was shuffled around a lot. So my religion was whoever I was with at the time telling me what my religion was.
Got it.
But my mom
Yeah.
used to say, go to church. And then I would have to walk the neighborhood and go find a church to go to. So I just walked into all kinds of random churches and saw things. But my aunt and uncle, who took us for a few weeks every summer, they were really religious. And that was where a lot of the religious trauma happened for me.
Mhm.
And when I got married, I married into a Catholic family and they did not approve of me at all because I wasn't Catholic. So that was more religious trauma. And so, anyways, I wrote about it in there. And there's one piece in there that I would share, but it's pretty dog eared. So we could go to something else. But
No, you're fine. I was just like, I was looking at this fun bookmark you sent me. And while you're looking for that, I'm just going to read some of these little highlight one sentence, one liners. Writing saved me after it flayed me. Look into your wounds. That is where the poetry lives. Breaking cycles is lonely. The grief persists like some sort of intermittent torture ritual. You never fought for me. And then savage, which is your kind of all encompassing, I guess, one word for this process for you. That's like a savage poetry, right?
yeah, because most of my life, I've been, living in that perfectionist, very say nice things, be kind, forgive everyone. This is the religion that's playing a
Yeah.
part a lot. And the way women are supposed to behave, dress appropriate, don't
Nice
argue,
girl. Yeah.
yeah, all the things. And so as I was writing or hemorrhaging, as I would say, that's why I was so in so much shame when I would see my words because I'd be like, well, you can't say that. You can't feel that way. And so to me, it was like hemorrhaging. But now when I look back at my words, they're not so harsh, but they would be too harsh to someone who's still in that perfectionist, being very appropriate with your words, not using, certain adjectives and things. I'll use the F word a couple times in this book. And, I reconsidered that, but it's not that big of a deal. It's just that it was for me at the time. So this one poem that came out of me way back in the beginning when I was in the deep deconstruction part of it, because that was going on as well during this healing period.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's the worst.
And it's not a knot. It's not a little knot. It's a huge knot. And it's
Yeah.
like, oh,
It
it's
just
the
keeps going.
deconstruction. Yes.
Absolute rabbit hole. Yeah.
Yeah. But I said a spiritual predator, someone who tries to manipulate your spiritual journey, bypass your pain with scripture and prayer, and control the outcome of your soul.
Mm.
And for me, that was huge. I posted it in my support group, which I had a deconstruction group that I was in, and that really helped me so much.
I'm glad you brought that up. That having a tribe, a supportive tribe, is absolutely pivotal when you're in these dark
Mhm.
seasons. Yeah.
And I feel like because of that group of people, and it was full of very smart, educated people, ex pastors, theologians, scholars, people in this group that know things in and out. That expedited my healing process in that area
Mm,
very quickly, which I am forever thankful for,
mm.
because I never fully deconstructed. So now I'm fully deconstructed and I feel completely fine about that. That's the good stuff. But the stuff I'm still dealing with is the grief of my childhood and the grief of being estranged from family, but not the deconstruction. I'm like, no, I'm good.
Yeah, that's so powerful. Yeah, I think you know a little bit about my background. Religion of origin is Mormonism. And, I didn't even start questioning or having serious deconstruction, even putting me on a path of that till I was almost 50 years old, exactly 50
Mm,
years old.
mhm.
Seventh generation Mormon, going all the way back to the church's foundation. So it's intergenerational. There were a lot of complexities to it. And I'm 5 years into the deconstruction. I have actually heard the Naked Pastor, I don't know if you know him, but a few other
Yeah, I
people
have.
saying
Mhm,
that deconstruction is a lifelong process because you're not just deconstructing religion or, like you could say, dogma or ideologies
mhm,
in the space of religiosity or theology. You're deconstructing it in academia and government and the media. And so that's why I say, it's like you said, it's like this thread that just keeps going and going and going. But as it relates to your religious path, it sounds like that's a complete cycle for you. And you were able to be like, okay, I've gotten to the bottom here of what this did to me, how it affected the way I live my life and the choices I made. For me, my religion was so all encompassing. It was my entire worldview. Every single choice that I ever made was based around the theology.
yeah.
And a lot of it was fear based around
Mhm,
consequences that would ensue if I made the wrong choice.
mhm,
And that fear was pretty alive. It's still something that I deal with on a regular. Am I doing this wrong? Like you were saying, when you started writing
mhm,
and you're like, can I really say that? Is that okay?
mhm,
Is that
mhm,
approved?
mhm.
Like who's
And it's
approving
the
things?
same for me with the religion as well. Everything you just said, exactly the same, like just living in fear of this and that, and I don't have that fear anymore, and that is such a great feeling. And I said to somebody the other day, because I'm still deconstructing it, I can see when the religion shows up, but or the brainwashing as I would call it, but
I think it would be really cool if you could just kind of share with our listeners and watchers on YouTube and through audio, like what would be, I guess, your greatest piece of advice for someone who is feeling just that turmoil and angst, and they know on some level I'm about to head into dealing with some things that I have stuffed my entire life. Okay.
yeah.
So that's the first part of the question. Well, let's just start there actually. Like, what did you do? Like, you obviously did everything quote unquote right. You stopped, you incubated, but you also were doing some self-care rituals that you'd already laid patterns down for. So you had that as an anchor, like yoga and mindfulness and nutrition. But yes, what would you say to someone who's sort of on that precipice of knowing they're about to kind of go down into some shadows and there's some fear or some
Mhm.
reticence around that?
Mhm. Or they might be just getting into it because you can kind of feel when you're falling and it doesn't get better before it gets worse. But, looking back, the one thing I learned along the way, I listened to a lot of podcasts, but as you're healing yourself apart, self compassion, and I write about that in the book, there's a couple poems there, is a lifesaver,
Mm.
especially when you're coming from a place of living, because I always had an inner critic, and anytime anything went wrong in my life, in my relationships, I always blamed myself and I would attack myself.
Mhm.
And so as I was in this place, I began practicing self-compassion and self-love.
How did you do that? What was the way that you did that? Was it just through self-talk or how did you do that?
Well, it's funny because I was listening to a podcast, and this was at the beginning before I had even gotten into the deep, dark place. I wasn't well. There was stuff wasn't right, but I hadn't gotten to the dark place yet. But somebody had brought up self compassion, and there was a discussion around it. And a light bulb went on for me. I was like, oh, like at first it's like, what is that? And it was like, it's a love for yourself in the state that you're in. So if the stuff in your mind is like dark or anything that comes up when you're grieving or you're angry, because grief has many faces. It can become anger, jealousy, resentment. I mean, I don't know what the
Right.
faces of it are, but as those voices in my head came up, and the self-attacking, and how dare you write this down, and you don't know what you're saying, or anything, I then remembered that conversation that I had heard about self-compassion, and I thought about, if your child, this is someone who loves their child, because I didn't experience any of that. Anytime I shared any emotions, I was punished.
Mm.
So I sort of took the route I did with my children, because I was very loving towards my children. And so I said to myself, hence the inner child thing, it's okay that you're feeling this way. It's okay that you're angry. It's okay. And I tried to nurture my anger, nurture my all the stuff that was coming
Mhm.
up. And so that's what self-compassion looks like. It's compassion for the state that you're in, instead of believing that there's something wrong with you, because I spent my whole life thinking something was wrong with me.
Yeah.
And I kept trying to solve, I was kept trying to fix myself.
Yeah.
And all I needed was compassion, and no one gave me compassion. So I gave myself self compassion. And it was a first, it was just the awareness at first, and then just trying it out and trying it out. And so it was a change of the self talk.
Yeah.
And now I can do that.
And you can bring that forward at will because of what you've been through. Like, you can access it now and you can notice it.
Yes.
Yeah.
I even practiced it today.
Yeah.
Every time I'm doing anything, and fear comes in, then I invite, if you will, self-compassion. And it is like reparenting yourself. I mean, because really that's what I am doing and will be doing for the rest of my life, is
Yeah.
reparenting myself.
It's so true. And I think that one of the plagues of our day is chronic self-inadequacy, where,
Mhm.
like, it's just what you were talking to, question, we doubt, we criticize, it's just really like we are our worst enemy on, and essentially if we're waiting for somebody to give us compassion, we are waiting endlessly. And I think there's a part of us in a victim
Mhm.
mentality where we're just waiting for that to happen, for someone
Mhm.
to save us, rescue us, fix us, love
Mhm.
us. That was my big awakening because that was what my programming was. Someday, whether it was a Jesus or somebody else is going to come along and wipe out all of these feelings you have. And it
Mm.
kind of precluded me from sitting in shadow. And so I bypassed a lot and I put a happy
Mhm.
face on.
Yeah.
And then I would always be let down because I thought, oh, I didn't get rescued from that emotion, even though I thought I did everything right. So what am I still doing wrong? Right.
Mhm.
And it was that transactional exchange of spirituality, as opposed to what if we were told, Andrea, while we were sitting in church as little girls, you're so whole and perfect just as you are.
Mhm.
There's nothing wrong with you.
Mhm.
You're
And there's
divine.
nothing you need to fix.
There's
You're
nothing to
perfect.
heal, save.
Mhm.
You're not, yeah. I'm so convicted around that right now just because I raised
Mhm.
my first set of kids in that. And I've seen
Mhm.
some of their fallout. I've seen my own fallout with that, try to reconciling that. Okay, so let's move forward in time a little bit. I'm curious if I would love to have you read another passage, and then we can kind of share with people how they can find your book and connect to you online.
Yeah, and I'm going to read 2 pages. One, it's called The Ledge, and it's real short. It says, "I had it all under control, my not so perfect life." At first it had said my perfect life, because just everything was so perfect. It wasn't even close. The life I crafted and chiseled out of the need to belong and be loved. I did not anticipate the fall. Not certain anyone ever does. And a lot of people are avoiding the fall. They will never fall because they'll keep distracting, they'll keep acquiring, they'll keep consuming, they'll keep
Yeah.
whatever.
And they don't feel like there's anything there to catch them. They don't feel like they have their own back, and they don't feel like the universe has their back. And so
Mhm.
to fall means to go into an eternal abyss, literally. And that's where the self-compassion comes in, I think, don't you?
Yeah, and the self-trust, because the compassion comes in when you're falling and you're making what seems to be all these mistakes, but you're not. You're right where you're supposed to be. And I didn't realize that I didn't trust myself. So this is a great segue, if that's the right word. So there's one here: self-trust is a superpower. How do we obtain this superpower? We figure out who the fuck we are by removing all the voices and all the lies. We remove our masks, we speak up, we start honoring our heart, we continuously carve out who we want to become as we grow and evolve. We stay on the path as we paint our very own beautiful landscape. As we begin to witness the awe of our own uniqueness, we learn self trust and to never doubt ourselves again. And
Mm,
that was something I didn't have because I was so entangled in everybody else's projections, belief systems, voices, the hatred, all the stuff. And that's when I said I shut all the doors. There's a poem in there. I shut all the love doors, pushed everyone out, locked the key. Nobody could come in because I had to get all the voices out of my head and
mm.
figure out who that I
Yeah,
was.
exactly. And that's so powerful. And I think that that is the rite of passage into kind of the soul sovereignty or the reclamation of your wholeness is
Mhm.
to literally, put everything at arm's length and regroup within yourself and find out what's true for you. And for me, the only anchor that I had, and I remember, I've probably shared this on the podcast before, but I remember I was talking with like a trauma coach who was helping
Mm,
me.
mhm,
And I was like, I just don't know anything. Everything is so ambiguous and weird. And like, I was really in it. And she said, do you love your kids? And I was like, yes, like in a nanosecond. And she goes, that's something you know. And I was like,
mm,
"Ooh." She said, "If that needs to be your anchor of something
mhm,
you absolutely know,
mhm,
then let that be your anchor until you can learn to do that until you can learn to live yourself that way as your anchor."
mhm, mhm,
And that was so profound for me. And I remember there were lots of nights that I was swirling and not knowing like what was up or down, or it was just very disorienting. Like I was hurling into outer space. I was untethered. And so I would remember, oh, I love my kids. That's right. I know that. I know
mm,
that I love my kids. I know that I love my
mhm.
husband, right? Okay, so any last parting thoughts before we share with our listeners? Is there anything else that maybe was pivotal to your transformative journey or your creative journey that you want to share with our listeners?
Well, if you are suffering or you're going through this existential crisis, or there's so many names for it, right? A rebirth, an
Mhm.
untethering, an unraveling, feel it, sit in it, but also do things that will be an antidote to that. And that's where the art came in as well. Yeah, there was something else I was going to say earlier based on what you had said about your kids, but yeah, just the self-trust is huge. Like once you gain that self-trust, trust what you're going through, trust the process, trust yourself. There's a reason why we have an intuition.
Yeah.
And for me, the what I learned from this whole process is that I am worthy of love.
Mm,
And that seems to be an overused word. I never really understood it, but now I really know what it means. And it means I was worthy to be loved as a child. I was always worthy. I'm worthy now. I trust myself and I will not accept or tolerate anything other than what falls under that category of me being
mm.
worthy. I'm not afraid anymore. I'm not afraid of losing people. I'm not afraid of using my voice. I mean, still am. Like I was afraid today, but I've come so far to be able to push a publish button and it's like, oh no, what's going to happen? And that's why I'm speaking to you today because I have to not be afraid of who I am and what I believe because I'm worthy.
Yeah, you took the leap. You pushed publish. We can't be risk aversive if we're trying to up level, right?
Yeah.
What I keep hearing when I'm listening to you is just this lots of courage. So I want to honor that. Where can people find your book, Andrea? What's the best place for them to go to get that?
Well,
Well, we should probably say the
there's
name of it. Have we even said the name of it?
I don't
Hold it up.
know.
It's called A Poet's Playground. And your pen
Uh-huh.
name, you want to explain your pen name?
Yeah, and the subtitle is Savage Poetry for Inner Child Healing. And then you can find it on my website. If you go to my website, then there's all the links there that take you to Amazon and Barnes and Noble or my Etsy store. I would love to talk about
What's your website?
it's Shydrea. So it's C as in Charlie, Heydrea, which is half of my daughter's name and half of my name, Cheyenne plus Andrea.
I love it.
And
Cool.
I'm Shydrea on everything, all my socials, even TikTok,
Hmm.
and everywhere, just so you can find me. And yeah, yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Andrea. This really deepened into my own, helped me deepen into my own, I guess, integration of my own dark night seasons, just having this conversation today. So thank you.
And I really appreciate you being willing to have this conversation because these conversations, I'd like to see and hear more conversations like this where people are actually telling their stories and using their voice and healing together. Because
Mm,
every conversation I have with someone like you is just another healing opportunity.
mm.
And thank you for being a safe space.
Thank you. Hey, it's Cherie here. Have you gotten my free whole body healing kit mini course? All you have to do is ask to join our private Facebook group, Soul Rose Community, and we'll send it right to your inbox. And I want you to know that I am so grateful for every single one of you who listens to these episodes. You can follow me on Instagram at cherie.burton to deepen into the discussion that you heard today. And I would be ever so grateful if you would leave this podcast a positive review on Apple Podcasts. This allows many more people to find these kinds of healing and empowerment gems that we bring forward in our discussions. And if you want to see our faces, check out my Soul Rose Show YouTube channel. Have a glorious week, and we'll talk to you next time on The Soul Rose Show.